Whew. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dalton Dismore, and I am presenting to you on narrative criticism. So, first things first, I guess to define narrative criticism, De Silva, our textbook, he does a really good bit on narrative criticism in the chapter on John. I want to say it's on page 348. He actually goes through it very intricately. Narrative criticism invites attention to the story, basically. So it talks about characters, plot, other literary features an author uses to create a story world. So things to look at when you're talking about narrative criticism that De Silva points out is number one, the implied author. So while historical criticism studies the real author, narrative criticism studies the author implied by the text. What does the reader learn about the person telling the story from the story itself? What beliefs and convictions does he or she hold? What is the implied author's social orientation? In other words, what is the reader's impression of the author? The implied reader, so basically the search for the ideal reader, as De Silva puts it, the one who will respond positively to all the cues given in the story. So I'm going to go on to talk about that a little bit more when I go into Paris. But De Silva also goes into, and actually I want to add that De Silva, he plays a lot off of Mark Powell, who is in our other textbook, Hearing the New Testament, and a lot of these things. Mark Powell actually does a little bit more in-depth into all of these subsections. But continuing on, the process of reading, there are various things that play into this. So the way the story unfolds is the first big question. Where does the author begin? What's his process of telling the story? What is assumed the reader knows from the story read up to this point, to a certain point? What should the reader know from outside the text? Is there pop culture references that the author is making that we should know about, that the reader at that time, the ideal reader, would pick up on? How might other knowledge experience affect the reader's, how might other knowledge or past experience affect the reader's experience in reading the text or the story? Is there any foreshadowing? Are there connections the reader should make? All these play into the process of reading. The next thing is structure. Are there clues to how the reader will understand the structure of the narrative? Smaller parts of the narrative, perhaps signaled through repetition of phrases, divisions into episodes, established patterns of question and answer, challenge and response, and the like. One of my favorite examples of this, and this is what I actually did my paper on. My book intro paper on this book is Revelation. So Revelation can be read narratively. It should be read narratively, in my opinion. But Revelation is actually, there's a lot of patterns and a lot of signals. For instance, one phrase that is used a couple times in the story that signals a shift in vision, a shift in what's happening, is when John says he's in the Spirit. It automatically shifts what's going on in the story. So whereas you may be seeing this thing play out, whenever in the Spirit is, whenever John says that he's in the Spirit, what it signals to the readers is that, okay, now I'm changing what's going on. Not necessarily what's going on in the story, but it's a shift in the vision. So now it's going to a different part. That's one of my things. So focus is the next thing that De Silva goes on about. What is the author doing to direct the reader's focus to particular things in the story? Why would he be doing that? So it's really just self-explanatory. What is the author doing to shift the focus of the readers? And we need to be paying attention to that. Other literary things I've mentioned earlier, like plot, what's the plot of story? Is it a mission? What's driving the plot forward? What's the climax? What's the conflict? Asking all these questions of the text. Characterization, who are the characters? How are they portrayed? what does the author let the reader know about them? Points of view. Whose perspective is the story being told from? Is that from the narrator's perspective? Is it from first person, third person? Setting. Where is the story at? What geographical locations go into this? Is there anything that plays into those geographical locations? Is there anything important? Alter, and I want to talk about it later, Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, he does a very good thing with type scenes. So if the story's happening at a well, then it's probably about a dude meeting a girl. So where is it at? Other literary things like irony. I believe this is De Silva, or maybe it's in another book that talks about John, or maybe it's Luke. Talks about the book of Luke, and it talks about how the irony of John the Baptist being introduced, as a prophet and being mistaken for the Messiah, and then later on Jesus. Because John the Baptist was paving the way for the Messiah, and him being the irony of him being mistaken for the Messiah, and then later on it's double played on it by Jesus being mistaken for John the Baptist, the actual Messiah being mistaken for the prophet. So there's a little bit of irony there. Symbolism, again, Revelation, big thing with symbolism. The lamb slain. There's a lot of things done with thunder, lightning. Just a lot of symbols going on there with gemstones, and there's a lot you get into with symbolism, but even in other stories as well. And then a big thing that we do that you have to pay attention to is intertextuality, especially with the Bible. So intertextuality is two texts communicating with each other. So anytime that an Old Testament text is referenced, anytime an Old Testament text is quoted, that's intertextuality. When Jesus quotes Isaiah, intertextuality. So there's a lot of things being done there. Here in the New Testament, so I talked a lot about De Silva. Like I said, here in the New Testament, Powell in his chapter on narrative criticism, he does a lot of things, these same things that De Silva does, or maybe it's De Silva doing a lot of things that Powell does, but he explains it a lot the same way, talking about the implied author, reader, going into all the literary things. But one thing that he does explain better is he explains people's objections with narrative criticism, usually having to do with what it doesn't do, what narrative criticism doesn't do at a historical level, or with its limited view on reader response. Some of these are valid objections. So basically, as far as the reader response, people thinking that having an implied reader limits the view of responses that a reader can have, so that there may not be an ideal reader. So they take, I think one thing that Parrish talks about a lot is feminist critics. So with Alter, he talks about the implied reader being a patriarchal society, which could take away from a feminist reading of the text, but in reality, narrative criticism, it shouldn't dissuade you from doing real narrative criticism, a good narrative critical look at the text, because even though it may limit it, it doesn't mean that you can't do other views of the text. You can still do a narrative critical approach, is what I'm saying. And you can do a historical criticism approach, form criticism, source criticism, and if you want to, feminist criticism, reading of the text. But it's very beneficial to do a narrative criticism look at the text, to apply narrative criticism to the text, looking at it as a story. It's a very beneficial way of looking at the Bible. Whereas historical criticism breaks everything up and evaluates all the little pieces and where the story comes from, where this comes from. Source criticism, or if it's form criticism, looking at the different pieces and what it is. Is it a poem? Is it a legend? Is it a proverb? Where that does all these things. Narrative criticism puts them all together. Alter actually said it in The Art of Biblical Narrative. Alter said it best, I think, where historical critics, they look and they want to get to the atoms of the text and analyze all the atoms. Narrative criticism recognizes that the author knew about the atoms and order them in a specific way to draw out responses. So both are beneficial, both do different things, but they can work together. So narrative criticism, in my opinion, is a very good way of looking at scripture, a good way of looking at the story. Continuing on, though, Parris, our very own Dr. Parris, his dissertation is published, Narrative Obtrusion in the Hebrew Bible. Dr. Parris actually does a very good history opening up his book, or his paper on narrative criticism. So he starts out by he talks about Herman Gunkel. He was a form critic. He did a book, Legends of Genesis, in 1901. And while he didn't, it wasn't full blown out narrative criticism, he started paving the way for narrative criticism. He also created some obstacles, but no one's perfect. He traced Genesis to a form of narration where a storyteller would embrace performance art to provide the emotions missing in the text. So Gunkel acknowledged that there are questions that the reader that people wanted to know about the story. So like the thoughts Adam and Eve had before eating the apple, and he traced that back. The what's the word? The lack of what the author did in not putting that in there, the thoughts, the emotions of Adam and Eve before and after they ate the apple, or before they ate the apple, he traced it back to a form of narration where the person telling the story orally would provide the emotions in real time and performance art. Very good thing. Erich Orbach, Parris talks about him. He was a literary critic in the 40s, and he wrote a book, Mimesis, and he defined the biblical narrator and brought more literary tools of interpretation. One big thing he did was he embraced the characters of the Old Testament, talked about them and what they did. But really, you can't really talk about narrative criticism without talking about like the two powerhouses back in the 80s. And this published first, but he actually presented on this first, if my research serves me well. David Rhodes and Joanna Dewey and Donald Mitchie. But I think it was just originally David Rhodes and Donald Mitchie who published Mark S. Story. And this was the first big thing done in narrative criticism, and it was on the New Testament. And I think this was actually presented in the 70s, wasn't published until the 80s, but it does a very good job at evaluating all the literary tools, the literary pieces that go into Mark, breaking it down, the plot, the characters. It's very good in what it does. And then the other one, it's an Old Testament one, but it was published before this, but he presented first. But it's Robert Alter's The Art of Biblical Narrative, and he talks about the drawbacks of historical criticism, what it finds wanting. I talked about what he said about the atoms of the story, but he really tries to find a middle ground between historical criticism and literary criticism. Where he finds that historical criticism and the people of new criticism, where they're so far on the extremes that both of them in some way or the other lose the voice of the author. He wants to give the author a voice. So he's very good. Someone else that I found that also really what I like is this is James Ressigway, Narrative Criticism of the New Testament, and he actually has a very nifty thing in the back of his book in how to approach a text and applying narrative criticism. So going through what to ask of the text. So rhetorically, is there repetition of keywords, phrases, themes, patterns, situations, or actions? Do verbal threads suggest a theme? If he goes into setting, what geographical, topographical, architectural settings are present? Are they symbolic? He has more on that. Characterization, what do the characters say? What are their first words? Is a tone or attitude implied in their speech? Point of view, what is the evaluative or ideological point of view of the narrative? Does the narrator provide asides that reveal a character's point of view? How does the character's point of view confirm or clash with the narrative point of view or with others' character's point of view. Plot, what conflicts are present in the narrative? Are there conflicts with nature, with the supernatural, with society? Does the character have internal conflicts? The reader, as the reader, what expectations are developed in the implied reader, and how are they fulfilled or frustrated as the narrative proceeds? And he has other questions in those sections, but those are just a couple. But Rezegue, I didn't go all through it, but what I really liked was his kind of guide to approaching a text with narrative criticism. It was very good. So all these great books, I'll cite them all in my comments. But as far as narrative criticism in the New Testament, something that Pentecostals do, where something that we hold, very dearly in our doctrine, that we actually get as a narrative criticism, is speaking in tongues. So it's not something that's it's not something that the Bible straight out comes out and says you need to speak in tongues, but it's something we draw from the narrative. So in the book of Acts, which is a narrative, in Acts 2, Acts 8, Acts 2, Acts 10, 8 and 19, narratively there's something going on there, and it's a pattern that keeps happening, and it's where we derive the evidence for speaking in tongues. So while I do think narrative criticism doesn't do everything we need it to do, that we do need to approach the text with other forms of criticism, I think narrative criticism is an important thing in biblical studies. We need it. We need to keep approaching the text as a unified text, and it's very important to us. So narrative criticism, thumbs up. I love it, and it's something that we need. We've gotten a lot of core doctrinal beliefs from it, and but we also need to pair it with other forms of criticism as well to fulfill other things. So yeah, it's Dalton Dismore on narrative criticism. Thank you.